So, Hogwarts Legacy is finally released, and it's pretty good, actually. But I do want to emphasize, it's just good. It's not revolutionary in any way. It's not going to push boundaries for the future of gaming, or whatever some people may have hyped it up to be. But I honestly think that's fine. I was not expecting a Harry Potter game of all things to be any good, and so it easily surpassed my non-existent expectations. Honestly, the controversy surrounding this game is more interesting than the game itself. It may go down in history as the least successful boycott of all time, showing that a fraction of a percentage of the population has no real sway in what the average consumer purchases, especially when Harry Potter is one of the most popular IPs amongst normies of all time, famously being the only book series a lot of people have ever read. So as someone who's not really a fan of Harry Potter and never was, I've watched all the movies and I remember trying to read one of the books as a kid, but I was more of a Chronicles of Narnia type of guy, and I honestly always thought that the Harry Potter series was kind of lame. So I really had no personal investment in the franchise going into this, but I still thought the game was pretty good. That said, you do need to know up front that this is basically just a Ubisoft game. It might not be made by Ubisoft, and I should mention this is being developed by Avalanche Software, not Avalanche Studios. Avalanche Studios developed the Just Cause series. Avalanche Software has only made Disney shovelware up until this point. So honestly, it's pretty impressive that this game is any good at all. But because it is basically just a Ubisoft-style sandbox game, it comes with all the positives and negatives of their games. So for this review, I'm just going to go through the positives and negatives of the game, of course starting off with gameplay, as I always do. As I said on stream several times, the gameplay is more fun than it looks. It's not necessarily complex, it really isn't at all, but it does take a little bit more skill than you would think. Now, in the early game, it doesn't really give you a whole lot of options. Your basic controls are circle to dodge roll, triangle to block and counter, and you tap R2 to fire a basic wand bolt that just deals damage, and you hold R2 and press one of the face buttons to use one of your real spells. As you might expect, spells have a wide variety of different effects. There's over 20 of them, but you can basically break down the combat spells into 4 different types. You have control spells, force spells, damage spells, and unforgivable curses. Control spells focus on disabling the opponent temporarily, whether that's making them float in the air, or freezing them, or transforming them into a harmless object. Force spells allow you to push an enemy in a direction, usually to juggle them for your various air combos, which is the bread and butter of the combat for the first half of the game. The damage spells are pretty self-explanatory, they do the most damage, but with the added effect of being able to set your opponent on fire or disarming them, or even hitting multiple at the same time. As for the unforgivable curses, all 3 of these have a unique effect. Crucio disables the opponent for a very long period of time, and once you pick an upgrade in the talent tree, it becomes one of the most broken spells in the game, spreading the curse debuff across opponents, which allows you to damage everyone at the same time. Imperio mind controls any enemy for at least 10 seconds, including the ogres, which are insane damage sponges, so obviously you're going to want to mind control them at every opportunity. And then finally you have Avada Kedavra, which instantly kills any non-boss enemy in the game. And once you get the talent tree upgrade, it can kill every cursed enemy at the same time. Now, if you remember what I said about Crucio just a few seconds ago, I think you know where this is going. Now, thankfully, you don't get Avada Kedavra until very near the end of the game, and possibly into the post-game. But once you upgrade both of these curses, you can end combat in less than 10 seconds. Now for the rest of the game, the combat basically just devolves into levitating an opponent, shooting them a few times, pulling them toward you to levitate them longer, casting a damage spell, shooting them a few more times, and then swapping to one of your other spell presets so that you can use those combos, And if you have a third and fourth preset of more damage and control and force spells, you can swap to those as well. And by the time you've used them all, you can swap back to your first set of spells. Now, while this is happening, enemies will obviously try to attack you. And if you get an orange warning sign on your character, that means you can block it and counter with Stupefy, which stuns an enemy. Or if it's a red warning, then you have to dodge roll. And I actually almost forgot one other element of the combat, that being usable items. I honestly didn't even use them that often. Not that they're underpowered, they're actually decently strong. They just didn't really feel necessary. The potions all have decently powerful effects, especially the Edurus potion, which makes you practically invincible once upgraded. You can also boost spell damage, reduce cooldowns, that sort of thing. As for the plants, 2 of them actually assist you directly in combat, attacking enemies, and the third type can stun all enemies in a radius. The only problem with the consumable items is they're tied to a mobile game tier crafting system, which is absolutely awful. Now, having to find the materials in the world, I don't have a problem with that, because you can also buy them too. But crafting takes real time. Was this originally tied to an in-game store or something? It makes no sense. So all of that sounds pretty basic, so why do I think it's a good combat system? 2 reasons mainly. I'd say in most combats it goes pretty quickly, especially as you get past the halfway point in the game and you can just spam damage spells. Enemies die in just a few hits, which is always satisfying. And the other reason is, while you're trying to swap between all of your spell presets and timing these different combos in the right order, you also have to be watching your character to know when to dodge or block. And this is a lot harder than it seems, or at least it is for me. So while you absolutely could probably take combat slower and effectively block and counter every attack and not get hit, it's much more fun to just spam all of your strongest spells as fast as you possibly can to end the combat quickly, even if you get hit once or twice. Now, I think just based on this description, you can probably already see what the problem is with the combat, in that I've basically just broken down every strategy there is. Levitating guys and shooting them is basically what it comes down to. Even if you transform them into an object or use Crucio or something, you're basically just taking the guy out of the fight. There's only a handful of meaningful interactions that you can have with enemies. In this game, about a third of your spells are utility only and have no function in combat, which really limits the creativity of the combat. At the end of the day, you're just blasting guys, floating guys, freezing guys, burning guys. That's it. The other major problem with the combat is the leveling and gear system and the lack of enemy variety, which have found their way into every shitty-ass modern game somehow. These light RPG mechanics never feel good. It doesn't matter what the game is. You need to either focus on making real RPG systems or don't bother. In this game's case, they went with the good old Destiny loot system, which I'm sure everyone loves. Instead of just making cosmetic-only clothes and having that be unique loot throughout the world, which would actually be satisfying and give you a reason to explore, instead, everything in the world scales to your level, including clothing, and all clothing has a stat attached to it, meaning that you have to change your gear in your menu like every 30 fucking minutes if you want to optimize. And half the clothes look like shit, which thankfully they did think to put a vanity layer of clothing, but you have to reapply the vanity layer every time you swap clothing, which means you're gonna waste even more time customizing your character. And so, of course, to help make the game more challenging, the game will also arbitrarily spawn enemies that are 1 or 2 levels higher than you. And much like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, if an enemy is 2 or more levels higher than you, it will take an absolute eternity to kill them, especially these fucking trolls. The only part of the gear system I kinda liked is that you can attach special upgrades to the higher rarity loot, which significantly improve spells or cooldowns or something. The only problem with that is because you're swapping out clothes so much, I didn't really end up using the feature much. I just don't even understand what the point of the RPG mechanics is if everything just scales to your level anyway. It just adds an arbitrary requirement for certain quests that you have to meet that level when there is no advantage for being over-leveled. Another problem with the combat is the lack of enemy variety. This is something you're definitely going to notice after the 10-hour mark. Like, imagine having like 500 artists working on your game to make like Hogwarts look as authentic as humanly possible. But then your game is also full of combat and only has 10 enemy types. Like, what the fuck are you doing? Your priorities are in the wrong place, motherfucker. And a few of them are just not interesting to fight in the least. Particularly the giant spiders and the inferi. They only have like 2 attacks. The only gimmick with them is you have to hit them with fire before you can damage them. And so every single fight with them is exactly the same. Now let's get to the quests in the open world. Starting first with the quests, as I believe that is the much better handled part of the game. I'm not going to get into the story because the story's pretty basic, and just in case you haven't finished the game yet, I won't get into spoilers. But the very basic overview is that you are admitted to Hogwarts as a 5th-year student, and your mentor, Professor Fig, hasn't taught you jack shit, so you have to take a bunch of extracurricular assignments to learn all the spells that you should know at this point. And your character is one of the most extreme examples of a Mary Sue I've ever seen. Not only is he or she good at literally everything when it comes to magic, you just have a natural affinity for it, but you're also a special snowflake who can see traces of ancient magic, which is obviously what the main storyline is about. And it also gives you a unique instant kill move during combat, which has a bunch of cool little animations. And on top of this, your character is a goody little two-shoes, polite and kind to everyone, unless you pick the small handful of asshole dialogue options, which don't fit in the least compared to literally all the rest of the dialogue in the game. And weirdly enough, one of the most Mary Sue elements of all for your character are the fact that you can get away with anything you want with 0 consequences, and that includes killing hundreds of people and goblins, despite the fact that your character emphasizes that he or she is not a racist, unlike Slytherin bro. I read that already.
Thinking?
I was thinking about dead goblins.
You could have got us killed.
But I didn't.
Lord Gok said,
Oh, your goblin friend?
stop it. That's enough. Not all goblins are like Ranrock.
Wrong. You have no qualms about killing the various poachers and goblins who are just following orders. And I really do mean kill. You're burning them to death, vaporizing them, inflicting a curse that tortures them, and then killing them outright with the killing curse. And speaking of curses, you can even cast those curses in front of your professors in the climax of the game. And you get away with it just fine. If I remember right, these curses are literally supposed to be illegal, but your character is so special that you can cast them. Now here's the thing, despite the fact that your character is basically God's gift to wizardry, I don't necessarily think that's such a bad thing. I actually really enjoy power fantasies in video games when they're handled correctly. I don't think there's anything wrong with being comically powerful or the most important thing in the universe, as long as you're not boring. Now your character is a little bit boring, but being good at everything does feel good, and has become increasingly rare amongst modern game protagonists. And by extension, I have to praise the overall tone of this game as well. They obviously played it pretty safe by making it kid-friendly, even more kid-friendly than the movies or books were. But I have to say, I kind of enjoy it. Feel-good fiction has become increasingly rare in our super cynical, always political world that we live in these days, where we're constantly being demoralized. When I play Hogwarts Legacy or SpongeBob SquarePants The Cosmic Shake, where everything is all positivity and sunshine and rainbows, even someone with a cold, dead heart like myself can feel a little bit of that joy rubbed off on them. Now, of course, I do have a few big problems with it, one of the major ones being that which of the 4 houses you pick has basically no bearing on the story whatsoever. Surprisingly, Slytherin has turned out to be the most popular house, which just proves to me that people are starving for an evil option in video games. I can't even remember the last time in a modern AAA game where we've been able to just be evil and that actually be baked into the story. Unfortunately, Hogwarts Legacy doesn't break that mold. There's a couple mildly evil things you can do, But even picking the most evil options in your Slytherin companion's side quest line doesn't really affect anything. But anyway, getting back to the quest design, I think the main quests are mostly good. The first dozen of them are essentially an extended tutorial, but not an insufferable one. The beginning of the game was a little bit too slow for me, but about 3 hours in, it starts to open up. And alongside the main quests are these extracurricular assignments. Most of them are not actually optional, even though they appear to be, as you need those spells for later quests. But I think even those quests were handled pretty well, as those serve as a more natural kind of tutorial. Now, my main problem with the story is the third act. I'm not going to spoil it, but let's just say this game feels incredibly rushed at the end and has one of the worst final bosses, at least in the last 5 years. The game just wraps up so quickly and so anticlimactically, even pulling a God of War Ragnarok trying to emulate an Avengers-style climax, but it fails horribly. But I'd say at the very least, the first half of the game kept me invested, and a big part of that was Hogwarts itself. It seems to me that a major focus of the game's development was making Hogwarts feel as authentic and detailed as possible, and this is truly where modern game graphics succeed. One of the few times I've seen graphic fidelity actually enhance a game. There is so much crazy detail in Hogwarts. Every nook and cranny feels handcrafted. It is so massive, and there's all these hidden rooms and staircases and passageways, just like the movies, that it really enhanced the experience and actually gave me a sense of immersion, which was very fitting given the last video I released on this channel. As an escapist fantasy, this game is actually pretty good. The main thing that's holding it back, though, of course, is the wokeness factor, which I'm sure many of you have seen this stuff by now, but I'll cover it anyway. The elephant in the room, of course, is Sir Rona Ryan, which the developers themselves actually admitted that this is a token trans woman character added only to try and mitigate the controversy surrounding this game. But of course, they should have known that would never work. These people are fucking crazy and they hate J.K. Rowling and want her dead, so you can't appease them. So instead, what we have is a character that stands out like a sore thumb. In the fucking 1890s, we have a trans character. Not to mention, we have magic that can literally transform your appearance, and yet this person still decides to look like that. Thankfully, she really only comes up in the story twice. It's a fairly minor role, and easily just could have been a biological woman. Then we have the other elephant in the room, that being Natsai Onai, one of the 3 companions that you meet over the course of the game. She's from the African equivalent of Hogwarts, Wagadu. Yes, that's its real name. And Wagadu is even bigger and more awesome than Hogwarts. It's the Wakanda of the Harry Potter universe. They don't even need wands to cast spells, and they can do it just as good. And yes, I know there's wandless casting in Harry Potter. The point is, wands wouldn't fucking exist if you didn't need them to enhance your magical ability. So her saying they're just as good is fucking bullshit. Also, her mother is one of the professors in the game, and all of the professors are diverse. Only one of them is a white male. Despite this taking place in Scotland in the late 19th century. And it just so happens that Natty's family are animagus, which basically just means they're furries. They can turn into their spirit animal. And so, despite me saying this was a somewhat immersive experience earlier, there's still quite a few things in this game that will destroy your suspense of disbelief. And no, it being a magical wizard world so nothing matters is not a good fucking excuse. How is it that Hogwarts was more diverse in the 1890s than the 1990s? Now, despite the fact this game is somewhat woke, it is also somewhat secretly based. And this is because J.K. Rowling is clearly one of those classic liberal women who is also unintentionally racist a lot of the time. Such as the goblins being these short, hook-nosed, demonic creatures who control the banks and probably also steal foreskins. Gee, I wonder who they're supposed to represent, and of course they're the bad guy of this game. Now, of course, to try and counter the possible racist implications of this, One of the main companion quests ends with a hashtag not all goblins moment. It's very
Well,
sloppily
he didn't want
handled.
anyone to know,
They're trying
so
to
he
turn it
cursed
into a
And she's never been the same.
anti-racism
So
message,
cruel.
kind of, right at the end.
Rookwood deserved what he got. Thank you for telling me. It wasn't a goblin. I suppose I owe you an apology. All this time I thought goblins were the enemy. But it was never that simple. Ominous said he's spoken with Anne. I wonder if she'll see me.
See. The other secretly based element of the universe, of course, is the House Elves, a literal slave race that everyone treats like shit. And they're happy to be treated like shit, they don't know any better. So let's not free the slaves, because they clearly enjoy being slaves. The only other vaguely woke angle I noticed is the increasingly popular inclusion of modern games to call your player character they, regardless of what your character looks like or sounds like, or in this game's case, whether you pick to be a wizard or a witch. And I think the obvious reason for this is they didn't want to have to record 2 lines for whenever they needed a pronoun to address the player. Now obviously the few times they call you a wizard or a witch, I'm assuming they call you the thing you picked. But this whole thing is just getting kind of tiresome. Yes, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if the game lets you pick your pronouns. I'm not going to try and make a mountain out of a molehill here, especially given it's becoming pretty standard. But for those of you who wanted to know, yeah, that's how it works. Now to get back to quest design again, let's get to the side quests. There's only 3 good side quest lines, and they're, as you could probably guess, the companion quest lines. Now, unfortunately, I'd say only one of them was actually worth my time, that being Sebastian Salo's quest, and it's obviously the most developed, and he's the most developed character by extension. Sebastian's character can be summed up with the idiom, "The road to hell is paved with good intentions." He genuinely cares about his sister, who has been cursed. Now, because their parents are dead, him and his sister live with their uncle, and his uncle thinks he should just give up on his sister and deal with the problem, I guess. And despite the vast magical knowledge of Hogwarts, they can't find a way to remove the curse. So, of course, Sebastian looks to the dark arts. And he becomes increasingly more evil over the course of the quest, but me trying to be evil in the game, I just agreed with every single choice he ever made, hoping that maybe I could get an evil ending out of this game, but of course you can't. And like I said, I won't spoil where it goes, but you're obviously going to want to do this quest line, as it is the only way to get the unforgivable curses. Now, as for Natty and Poppy Sweeting, their quests were entirely forgettable. Despite Natty being introduced to you within the first few hours of the game, and given this special snowflake backstory and all this shit, I can't even remember what her quest is actually about. And as for Poppy Sweeting, she's a Hufflepuff that you meet in Beast class, and basically she's just a hippie. She wants to save all the magical creatures who are being poached around Hogwarts. And the only memorable part of that was when you find and free a dragon and then have to give the dragon back its egg. Those 2 quests were interesting, but by the time you get to the centaurs, I already forgot what the hell we were doing and why, and so I stopped caring. Now, as for all the minor side quests, these are all absolute shit. They're all fetch quests. Even the one that gives you the lockpick spell is a fucking fetch quest, and one with no quest markers, by the way, so it might just be the worst quest in the game. You have to find all these fucking statues, only at night, all across the map, with no indicators as to where the statues are, so you're probably going to use a guide like I did. And all the other minor fetch quests are pretty much just mini stories, Witcher 3 style, except that most of them are not very interesting. Then we get to the open world itself, which, like I said, this is a Ubisoft game, so you can probably already guess the type of activities you're going to be doing. Thankfully, there's no towers, but there are small bandit camps you have to clear out. There's these Merlin puzzle trials that are all the same 2 or 3 puzzles, copy-pasted over and over again. There's like traces of ancient magic you have to find to expand your magic meter. And honestly, I don't even feel like covering the rest. Who cares? It's repetitive crap. The only vaguely interesting element of the open world is the ability to ride on your flying broom. being able to get to wherever you want on the map fairly easily, especially with the numerous fast travel points, does take out one of the major annoying elements of a lot of sandbox games. But the fact that there's no Quidditch is such a glaring omission from a Harry Potter game of all things. Instead, the only thing you get is a mini-game where you fly through rings, Superman 64 style. And you have to do this if you want to upgrade your broom to make it go faster. You can also capture various magical creatures around the world using your magical bag of holding, which is obviously supposed to throw a bone to those Fantastic Beasts movies. And you can even capture flying mounts and ride them instead of the broom if you want. And the captured creatures are used to give you materials to upgrade your gear. Like I said, I didn't really use this. I don't really care about this. Unless you can actually raise the monsters Pokemon style, it just seems completely pointless. So yeah, the open world kinda sucks. Hogwarts and Hogsmeade, which is the town that you're going to visit almost as often to sell your shit or buy some other stuff, were the only two interesting parts on the map. The rest, you could have pretty much just thrown in the trash, and I don't think it would have negatively affected the game that much. If you converted the open world into just a series of linear levels that you started from a quest at Hogwarts, I honestly think that would have improved this game, because there was no way I was going to waste time playing these stupid Ubisoft random objectives around the map to level up when you don't even need to. Doing the story and the major side quests where you learn spells kept me at a high enough level to do all the main story quests without doing optional content. So I only did like 7 or 8 minor side quests, and most of the companion quests. So the sandbox is easily the most generic and forgettable part of the game, as it often is in sandbox games. And yeah, that pretty much covers all the major points of Hogwarts Legacy. I probably could go into more detail, but honestly, I was not feeling very inspired by the end of the game. The first 10 hours were pretty enjoyable, and I actually had hopes that this would be a game that had a lot of love and care into it despite the flaws, but it seems like that love and care was mainly put into Hogwarts itself, in certain aspects of the immersion, like the dialogue, which, while not spectacularly written, at the very least is period appropriate. Unlike something like God of War Ragnarok, where they fucking use Newspeak in a magical ancient Norse land. I mean, come on, man. Modern writers are pathetic. So at least my suspense of disbelief wasn't broken by basic dialogue, but there certainly is a lot of dialogue. That would be one of my main complaints about the game for somebody like me, who hates constant cutscenes and shit. There's so much unnecessary dialogue in this game, and the dialogue choices are even more pointless, because they don't actually affect anything outside of just being a dickhead at the end of certain minor side quests. This game seems like it suffered from feature creep, where originally the developers probably wanted each of the 4 houses to feel different, but at the end probably realized they didn't have the budget or the time to make each one of them feel distinct, so instead, it's one giant homogeneous blob, and you just wear whatever color is your favorite color, but you don't actually get to roleplay in any way. All of the RPG elements of this game are underdeveloped, and most of them probably shouldn't even exist. And as far as a wizard game goes, I do wish there were a lot more creative spells, because as it stands, they're all either combat spells or puzzle spells where you already know exactly what to use and where, because the game makes it incredibly obvious. There's no real player choice in this game in the broadest sense of the word. That said, I still think it's a good game. It could have been an amazing game if they just trimmed down the repetitive stuff. Honestly, the open world could be half the size it is and still be just as interesting. Which honestly is most sandbox games, let's be honest. And I do have to emphasize that this game has a unique appeal from a purely immersive standpoint. If you want the experience of spending a year at Hogwarts and learning magical spells and experiencing the whimsical world that J.K. Rowling created, honestly, this game does a pretty good job recreating that, at least based on the visuals I remember from the movies. And like I said earlier, generic feel-good, child-friendly stories are growing increasingly rare. And it's not like it feels like it's for babies. People still die. In fact, a lot of people die. Mostly bad guys, but a couple good people do die over the course of this story. So, I don't know, I did enjoy it, and this is coming from a pretty cynical person, as you probably know. And the game did hold my attention for 15 out of 24 hours. That's better than most modern games, I guess. But past that point, it just felt like any other Ubisoft game where you've seen it all and you kind of just want it to be over. And it seems like the developers wanted it to be over too, given how rushed the last 2 missions in the game feel. So at the end of the day, it's pretty decent, but it's not a game I would recommend at full price, that's for sure, unless you're a huge Harry Potter fan, which all of you already bought the game and played it and probably enjoy it. But if you don't care about Harry Potter, just wait until it's like half off, and it might be worth your time. The sad thing is modern games is so shitty, this might actually make my best games of 2023 list. I guess we'll have to wait and see. Alright, see you next time, guys.